Hello geographers and welcome to another lesson in the Changing China unit. In this lesson we're going to be answering this question. How has China's development affected the environment? So we're really going to try and consider how China has been affected by its rapid development, particularly in terms of its environmental landscape. And then we're going to turn our attention to the sorts of things that are being done to help improve its environment. So you can see we are on to lesson 9 in our learning journey of the Changing China unit. We've looked a lot about its population, how population has changed in terms of its size and its population structure. We've looked at the economy and how rapidly it's improved, and particularly focused on the Belt and Road Initiative. We've then compared the changes that are occurring in some of the urban areas and also the rural locations in China. We're now going to bring it together and really think about how the development that China's seen has impacted on its environment. So make sure you've got a pen, pencil, ruler and something to write on. And if you can copy down today's title, How has China's development affected the environment? Underline it with a ruler and put today's date there too. So the first thing I'd like you to do once you've written your date and title is to study the image of this factory in China. I want you to consider what might be the issues linked to this image and try and think on both a local, national and international scale what the concerns might be. So pause the video while you have a go at that task. Okay. So you might have come up with a whole variety of different issues that you can see there. And I imagine one of the first things you're thinking about is the air pollution. Now that air pollution may affect the local area, but it may also spread out onto a national scale as the particulates are blown by the wind in the atmosphere. And they therefore could fall in another location, causing things like acid rain, and potentially could go wider afield. Many of you may also have made the link to things like climate change, and clearly that's something of an international scale. Some of you may have also looked or considered the health implications of this. How much regulation is there in terms of the smoke and the pollution that's being released? Is this something that's actually going to directly impact on people's lungs and respiratory systems? So there are lots of concerns that we can have about this. So let's move on to specifically focus on the air pollution that China's contributing in the world. Now, if you look at this graph very carefully, it's showing us the world fossil carbon dioxide emissions between 1970 and 2021. And what's immediately obvious on here is just how much a contributor China is to carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see millions of tons of carbon dioxide are being contributed by China every year. So what I'd like you to have a go at doing first of all is to describe the pattern of carbon emissions from China. So focus specifically on that red line. How many millions of tons were emitted back in 1970? How many by 2000? And at what point roughly are we at now? Then compare that to some of the other countries. So write down a few points in relation to perhaps the United States, or how does it compare to India? Okay, so have a go at doing that for me now and pause the video. Okay, so if we simply look at the total amount of carbon emissions, China is very much the leader. Now, something else we need to consider is perhaps why that is the case. And part of it is down to the fact that so many people do live in China. So it's perhaps not surprising that so many carbon emissions are coming from one country. So another way of thinking about the contribution that China makes to pollution and carbon dioxide emissions is to perhaps look at it according to how much each person is contributing to carbon dioxide emissions. So on this graph, this one's done slightly differently. You can see China right in the middle of the graph there. This is showing us the relationship between the amount of emissions created per person alongside the GDP, the gross domestic product, or the wealth per person. So it's showing kind of the relationship between those two factors. Now, when you look at the emissions per person for China, it's actually somewhere in the middle, which is a very different picture to what we saw on the previous graph that suggested that China is contributing a huge amount of pollution to the atmosphere, which it definitely is. But when you bring it down per person, a very different picture emerges. What's interesting here is that you've also got a number of other countries, particularly those countries that are very oil rich or oil dependent, coming further towards the top when you look at the amount of emissions per person. So areas in the Middle East, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, but also places like the United States are much more dependent upon things like oil and therefore have higher levels of CO2 emissions. What's interesting though is there doesn't seem to be an absolutely direct relationship between the wealth of the country and its consequent carbon emissions. So there is a suggestion that as a country begins to get richer, it may well emit more CO2 emissions. But over time, with continued development, there's often more focus on becoming more environmentally sustainable. So if you look at where the United Kingdom's positioned over here, it's got a high level of GDP, but actually the emissions per person is relatively low. So it's worth considering what's actually shown on this graph. So what I'd like you to do, you've got 4 questions there. What does it show overall? So what is the graph all about? It's showing that relationship between the amount of emissions each person produces and also the GDP per person in different countries. What does it tell you about China? So look at its position on the graph. How is it different to what the previous graph suggested? So it's a very different story being illustrated here. When you think about the previous graph, it really was kind of showing China is contributing vast amounts of carbon dioxide. It's terrible, it's awful, like they're the worst contributor. But this one kind of paints a slightly different picture when you look at it per person. And lastly, does this matter? And you might want to think about the political implications of whether or not you think this matters. Okay, pause the video and have a go at those 4 questions. Okay, so in terms of why does this matter or how does this matter, sometimes what we've found is that countries have been reluctant to sign things like climate change agreements because their argument is, well, if you look at it per person, we're not actually contributing as much as others. And so they are trying their best to perhaps economically develop, but they feel the restrictions on certain agreements may be stopping them from doing that. So you can see where they're coming from with that. It's quite an interesting perspective to look at. So let's move on. Let's think about the impact that China's rapid industrialization has had. Now, China's rapid economic development over the past few decades has had a significant impact on the environment. Now, some of the ways in which China's environment has suffered due to development include air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, and the loss of biodiversity. Now, what I'd like you to try and do is you're going to be pausing this screen in a moment so you've got opportunity to read it through very, very carefully. And I want you to try and summarise the information in no more than 50 words. Now, one of the ways that can help with doing that is trying to illustrate each of the points with some images. So you might want to literally divide your page into 4 sections, give each section a heading, and then perhaps draw an image first and then add a few bullet points about that particular type of environmental issue. So pause the video now and have a go at that activity. Okay, hopefully that's given you an opportunity to think about some of the environmental issues that China's currently facing. Obviously, air pollution is a big one, particularly with regards to the fact that they've used an awful lot of coal, and the environmental impact on that is coupled with the health problems. There are also issues in terms of water contamination, and that comes from both industry but also agriculture. Deforestation, the mass cutting down of trees, obviously that's having a huge impact on habitats. It's also one of the things that is reducing the ability of the planet to be able to absorb that carbon dioxide that we've mentioned earlier. And linking on to that, we're seeing that China's development has led to the loss of a vast variety of species of plants and animals. So this loss of biodiversity is having problems in terms of things like pollination and pest control. So we've got a whole variety of impacts there. So what on earth could China do in relation to those issues? So what I'd like you to try and think about, and perhaps you'd like to do this with the person next to you if you're working in pairs, or if you're at home, maybe kind of talk to somebody else at home with you, is try and come up with at least one solution that could perhaps tackle one of those areas. So can you think of something, for instance, that China could put in place to help solve the problem of air pollution? Could you maybe think of something in relation to deforestation? What could be put in place to help with that? So take a moment to think about that solution, and you can be as creative as you like and think really carefully about why it might be suitable. So pause the video and have a real think about that one first. Okay, now you've done that, let's have a think about some of the different solutions that are currently in place in China. So China is really focusing on developing its renewable energy sources. Now this is important because by using renewable energy, not only will the energy not run out, quite often our energy sources tend to not be polluting. So some of the examples we've got are things like the solar energy and hydroelectricity dams. The other thing we're seeing is they're trying to tackle desertification, whereby they're seeing the expansion of desert into areas that are not normally desert. And they're trying to reduce that issue by actually planting lots more trees in the form of the Great Green Wall. And that will be a fantastic thing for you to go away and find out a little bit more about. The other thing that China's doing is they're trying to put more and more electric cars in circulation. So that is having a direct impact on air pollution, because rather than having polluting cars, we've now got cars that are running on things like hydroelectricity. In 2017, it was also reported that China closed down 40% of its factories because they weren't sticking to the rigid regulations that they had in place. So all of these things combined are examples of what China's doing to tackle those environmental issues. But I want you to take a really critical eye with this. I want you to consider, out of all of those solutions, what are some of their advantages, which some of them will be very, very clear, but also what are some of their disadvantages? And for that, you might need to think more broadly in terms of the social implications of that, in terms of the impact on people, economic implications of that, what might be some of the political or the environmental implications as well. Okay, so have a go at thinking about each of those elements, or each of those solutions, should I say, and think about both the advantages and the disadvantages before then considering which solution you think is best. Now, I'd suggest you use a grid like this one, and your teacher may well have given you an example of this piece of paper already. Okay, so take a moment to have a go at filling that in, and then come back to the video as we'll go through some of the advantages and disadvantages with you as well. Okay, so if we look at the example of hydroelectricity, clearly this is a renewable energy, so it won't run out. And while the electricity is in operation, there'll be no pollution. However, in terms of the disadvantages, particularly things like the Three Gorges Dam, which we'll look at in next lesson, this has had a huge impact on the area, particularly with regards to building the reservoir. Looking at solar energy, again, providing energy without pollution, and it's renewable. But the thing to consider is if you put all of these panels, these solar energy panels in place, what do you then do with them once they've reached their lifespan? Are we storing up more problems for the future in terms of waste? Factory closures and regulations immediately reduces the amount of air and water pollution. It looks good internationally as well because it shows the government is being tough on polluters. Potentially, though, the disadvantage is that people might lose their jobs, and companies that have previously gone to China because the regulations are quite lax may well turn to other markets instead. This could then have an impact on things like exports and the earning potential in China. And lastly, we've got the Great Green Wall. Obviously, planting more trees can offset the carbon emissions and also encourage greater biodiversity. But in some places, people have actually been forced to move away in order to allow for this extra tree planting. So again, the social implications of that makes you need to think carefully about whether that's the right solution. So hopefully you've had a chance to think about those different examples and whether or not you think there is one that kind of stands out as being better than others. That will be for you to try and decide. Now, our last thing I'd like you to think about is here. China has clearly put its economic growth and industrialisation before protecting the environment. So in other words, it's tried to get rich before it does anything to look after its landscape and environment. Do you think that's the right way of doing things? Now, you might want to consider, is that what other countries do? And is it therefore the right path? Or might someone disagree with what your thought process is? So I think that's a really good question to leave you there with today. And I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. Speak to you again soon. Bye for now.